Charles and the restored monarchy. It appeared that Major General Lambert would be voted as Cromwell's successor, and further military rule was not desired by Parliament. However, shortly before his death in 1658, Cromwell kind of changed up the succession and declared that his inexperienced son Richard should become Lord Protector after his death, and this bypassed his more qualified son Henry. The reason he didn't choose Henry is because Henry is the younger brother to Richard, and obviously succession went to the eldest son, even though Henry has more experience than what Richard did. Now, the issue is that the same year Cromwell did die and was quickly succeeded by Richard. However, he was a civilian, he had no experience of warfare, no real experience of politics, and as a result of that, the Council of Officers forced him to resign in 1659 and recalled the Rump, which was quite controversial the last time it was in office. However, this was later closed down by the army, who didn't feel that the Rump were reformist enough or radical enough. Now, at the same time, a guy called George Monk assembled an army in Scotland to bring the Rump to power again. Lambert tried to react to the invasion, but was sent to the Tower due to mutiny within the army. So Lambert was betrayed by his own men. And Monk then entered England in 1660, but against the wishes of the Rump, Monk moved to reverse Pride's Purge. So Pride's Purge is from year 12, whereby General Pride purged the royalist members of Parliament out of Parliament to the pub called Hell and restored it with Rump supporters. And in March 1660, the restored Lawn Parliament voted to dissolve itself in order to give way for elections for the Convention Parliament, which then kind of looked at the restoration of the monarchy. Now, Monk had already started secret negotiations with Charles II, which was quite convenient given that the Convention Parliament was quite keen to restore monarchy control. Now, Charles had created his own proposal for a settlement known as the Declaration of Breda. This was accepted by MPs and became known as the Cavalier Parliament. The prerogative courts were therefore established. The 1641 Triennial Act was renewed, but did not include the clause of having to call Parliament every 3 years. This meant Charles would be able to resort to personal rule if he desired, which obviously didn't go down well with Parliament. Parliament then ensured that they controlled the militia, although the Militia Act of 1661 stated the king alone was in supreme command of the armed forces. So there's a bit of a kind of a negotiation between who has control over the militia, Parliament and monarchy. Charles, however, did double the size of the Privy Council to 120. So these are his advisors, though this made it difficult to manage, and as a result of that, he appointed favourites such as Edward Hyde, otherwise known as the Earl of Clarendon, and his pro-Catholic advisors became known as the Cables, which we will look at slightly later. Now, the Licensing Act reintroduced censorship of printed material, and the Anglican Church was restored, with a religious settlement being discussed at the 1661 Savoy Palace in London, and this later, as a result of this discussion, resulted in something called the Clarendon Code, and this Clarendon Code becomes really significant. It's spread over a period of 4 years, and there are different acts that come under this code. So the Corporation Act of 1661 restricted non-Anglicans from sitting on borough corporations, and therefore you could only sit in high governmental office positions if you were of the correct religion. The Act of Uniformity followed, with parish priests accepting the Book of Common Prayer that Charles introduced. 1,800 ministers refused and were expelled and deprived of their wages. The Conventicle Act of 1664 restricted dissenters from meeting in groups outside the Church of England, so that they weren't kind of doing religious conspiracies. And the 5 Mile Act forbade ministers expelled under the Act of Uniformity from going within 5 miles of their former parishes, so they couldn't corrupt their followers from when they were practicing ministers. Now, Parliament approved a regular income of £1.2 million per year. The hearth tax, based on the number of fireplaces in a house, was expected to raise a further £250,000 in its first year. But this was axed the following year after only raising 1/3 of what they expected to achieve. Now, Thomas Osborne, the Earl of Danby, emerged in the early 1670s as Treasurer and Chief Advisor when the Cables declined in their influence. His views were pro-Anglican and built support of MPs who were prepared to support the Crown now it changed direction. This was known as the court faction. So faction is where you've got two different groups wanting to achieve the same thing, but ultimately in very different ways. And this gave way to the first Declaration of Indulgence, whereby they permitted worshipping rights and relative freedom of dissenters and Catholics. This faced resistance within Parliament because they were fearful that Charles II was being tolerant towards Catholics. Now, what is really iconic about Charles's reign is that he has a pro-French foreign policy, bearing in mind that his mother was French, and this saw England being thrust into a conflict with the Netherlands, which the French were pursuing. So the Dutch destroyed 13 English ships on the Medway River in 1667. However, Charles continued to sign the Treaty of Dover in 1670 with the French, promising that any time the French wanted to re-attack the Dutch, that England would support them. Now, Charles had made a secret agreement with the French that he would convert to Catholicism at an appropriate time in exchange for French subsidies that would free Charles from dependence on Parliament, which does later come to fruition. Now, Charles embarked on a period of personal rule for the last 4 years of his reign due to Louis XIV's commitment to give Charles more money in 1675, which would mean he doesn't need Parliament. And that first payment of £100,000 then became real for Charles in 1681. So we have a real kind of concern over absolutism returning under Charles II. Now, Charles issued another Declaration of Indulgence in 1672 at a time that Parliament was not in session, so he's passing laws without parliamentary approval. However, due to his agreement with France over the Anglo-Dutch War, Charles was forced to suspend payments to his creditors, known as the Stop of the Exchequer, and to recall Parliament for more money. Now, in exchange for funds, MPs insisted on the passing of a Test Act in the place of the Indulgence, which forced holders of public office to deny key Catholic doctrines. Now, the Test Act removed Lord Treasurer Clifford and Charles's Catholic brother James, who was Lord Admiral at the time as well. So that meant that ultimately Parliament did not want James succeeding the throne, and Lord Admiral was quite a prominent role at this time. It meant he was head of the Navy. Now, the 4 acts of the Clarendon Code were undoubtedly part of a coherent strategy to create uniformity of worship, but by 1669 it was clear that the strategy had failed because Captain John Hodgson was arrested 5 times in 18 months, and passed in 1662, the Quaker Act resulted in severe penalties for refusing to accept the Oath of Allegiance, and George Fox, who was leader of the Quakers, was also arrested in 1664. Now, the Cables, so the kind of French alliance, pro-Catholic community within Charles's inner circle, created an anxiety surrounding Catholicism after the Restoration, which was further fueled by the Great Fire of London and the spread of the plague. So the Great Fire of London is a bit like the Reichstag fire with Germany, that there was a lot of conspiracies that Catholics had started the Great Fire of London, and the spread of the plague demonstrated that God was working against England and the monarch, and this sparked rumours of Catholic agents at work. Charles permitted Parliament to blame his chief advisor Clarendon, who was replaced in 1667 with the Cables. So the key Cables were Clifford, Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley and Lauderdale. Now in 1668, James, his brother, the Duke of York, later James II, converted to Catholicism, and this became public knowledge in 1669, further fueling the anxiety surrounding Catholicism. James also married a Catholic, Mary of Modena. This further fueled Catholic anxiety, as well as Charles had no children at this point and was supporting Louis XIV's attack against the Netherlands. And Danby, in contrast, arranged the marriage between James's daughter Mary to William, Prince of Orange, in the Netherlands. So there's a lot of anxiety surrounding Charles's reign at the moment in terms of what is his real intention surrounding religion and what type of church is he creating, plus is he going to adopt Charles I's strategy of having an absolutism monarch and therefore disposing of Parliament.